The second lecture is, as I've outlined on the board here, dealing with the psycholinguistics, the precursor, I think the precursor, to what I think is one of the amazing zeitgeists in terms of study of the mind, the cognitive turn. And so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about psycholinguistics and some of the work that was being done related to language learning, leading into the cognitive turn. And I will actually share with you some of the experiments, indeed, that occurred in conjunction with the cognitive turn. That are simple experiments, but incredibly profound relative to people's thinking about meaning making in ways that really challenged us to really rethink how we approach our students. Psycholinguistics was a natural precursor to the cognitive turn because, in conjunction with a combination of sort of psychology and linguistic studies of young language learners, we began to realize how powerful the child's language learning skills are from a very, very early age. Indeed, as some people would sort of say, from the age of being in the womb. But indeed, the expression that I found myself resonating to is that children seem to have the ability to learn language better than anybody can teach them. In other words, children learn for themselves, creating systems of learning language in ways that actually enable them to become a meaningful language user in a very open sort of fashion, far beyond the most expert linguist, even to this day, has actually been able to fully articulate. A number of people began to study what young children were doing, and one of my colleagues at the University of Sydney, Michael Halliday, who is well known in social linguistics circles. Some people would sort of say he's more of a social linguist than he is a linguist. Studied his own son in conjunction with a book, Learning How to Mean, and highlighted how his son, who he calls Nigel in the book, actually profoundly sort of explores the use of language in his environment in ways to interact. Well, numerous people have now studied how kids interact with their parents, how they interact with their worlds, and how they, in a sense, in a very self-determined way, learn how to communicate and use language elements in ways that are thoughtful and effective at the same time as becoming more and more refined in the use of language. A person who helped to sort of establish this was a person who's these days as well known for his political writing, is Noam Chomsky, who at this point, which is the 60s and early 70s, was a young scholar who was shaking up the world, and so you had these people studying language learning beginning to ask the question, well, what can we learn, not so much by focusing upon what children do on our tests, but what can we do if in fact we observe readers? You know, very much consistent with the sort of a Jean Piaget sort of orientation. Let's look at them and let's adopt a developmental approach. And in a sense, this is what psycholinguistics was all about. And in the field of reading, it manifested itself early in the work of Ken Goodman, who talked about reading as a psycholinguistic guessing game. And what he meant by that was, as people approach the reading act, they're hypothesizing. meaning making or reading is a form of using one's hypotheses to make sense of what one reads. And rather than use the term errors, he referred to his analyses of what kids were doing as they were reading as miscues, which might have appeared as errors, but sometimes were semantically and syntactically acceptable. And to begin to sort of emphasize that what we have going on in the act of reading is a form of creative meaning making by the reader using the text as a resource. And you've got to think about this for a moment, because oftentimes in schools we've approached readers forcing them to focus upon the literal or what's on the text, doing a close reading, before we ever engage them in the inferential or interpretive. And what this work was beginning to sort of say is, whoa, you guys have got this wrong. Indeed, a person has to be thinking inferentially about how this relates to their own world and what the connections are to that, to be able to understand the literal. So all of a sudden we were beginning to realize that not only did we have it wrong that things went from learning to read to reading to learn, but we also had it wrong that things went from the literal to the inferential to interpretive. That indeed, quite often, one is going from the inferential to the literal, and to understand something literally actually may be much more demanding than sort of dealing with one's own inferential construction of the world as a result of reading. You got this wonderful book by Frank Smith, and one of my favorite articles that I read of Frank's at this point in time. Frank, by the way, is took a position at the University of Victoria, did his doctoral work at Ontario. But there's a wonderful article in this book called 12 Easy Ways to Make Reading Difficult, and it's very much along the lines of perpetuating some of the things that I've questioned as practices. And one difficult way to make it easy. 12 easy ways to make reading difficult, and one difficult way to make it easy. And the difficult way to make it easy is, as he points out, is to respond to the child. And in a sense, what you see oftentimes happening in terms of reading curriculum, indeed all curriculum, is that we're teaching the curriculum, not the child. Indeed, at the time, a wonderful person, Dolores Durkin, who was studying how children learning to read, often made the sense that children aren't necessarily learning to read. They're having to learn how to learn to read. In other words, their task isn't so much learning to read as to figure out what the teachers want them to learn, supposedly in the course of learning to read. But anyhow, you have these developments occurring at an interesting time. And then you have the beginnings of what I consider to be the cognitive turn. And I actually think probably the best book that Howard Gardner, that some of you may have seen in his writing other books, that his best book is the discussion of the cognitive revolution called The Mind's New Science. And in the book, he actually points to a certain date. And it's sort of a profound date in history, not only for the cognitive purposes, but as you will see for other reasons. It was September 11th, 1955. And he claims that this is when, from his perspective, the turn began. And on a single day at a small conference at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Noam Chomsky, as a young man, gave an incredibly powerful talk, basically sort of saying that young children learn language for themselves. It's not a behavioristic event, that these children have these amazing learning systems. And it was, again, one of his most provocative talks and one of the most provocative discussions of language learning to that point. And then you had, on the same day at the same small conference, Simon and Newell, two people in artificial intelligence, two people in I would say cognitive science or computer science at that point in time, who were trying to teach machines to think, and were dealing with teaching machines to play chess and other things, reporting on their work, very much focused on, well, how is the mind organized? What do we know about how people think that we can actually try to emulate in our machines? And talking about the difficulties doing that, given the abilities of the mind to progressively refine, to suggest scenarios that might fit. And so at the same day, the same conference, you have Simon and Newell sort of really rattling people's cages relative to their thinking about thinking. And then you have a paper that some of you may have heard about by George Miller, where he talked about how the mind chunks things. The famous paper, I think it's entitled this, 7 ± 2, where he talks about how people have limits to their brain unless they begin to chunk things together. And so you have the beginning of thinking cognitively very much along the lines of a term of coming out of the work of Gestaltist, which was, how do we actually think holistically in conjunction with the particular as well? How does the mind work in Gestalt-like fashion to enable itself to think and to comprehend? Not just in the act of reading, but also in everyday affairs. Well, these developments out of linguistics, out of AI, out of a growing interest in tests were what I would consider to be the precursor for what Howard Gardner said occurred in 1955. In the field of reading, they really occurred in about 1975, when the federal government invited groups of people to get together, the federal government in the US, that included people from Canada and people from elsewhere, to really think about reading comprehension, and began to invest huge amounts of dollars to encourage research on reading comprehension. Indeed, at that point in time, the federal government established a place where I actually went to work, the Center for the Study of Reading at the University of Illinois, where it pulled together the leading cognitive scientists or educational psychologists at that time and artificial intelligence people to begin to study this phenomenon. And so at the Center for the Study of Reading, you had linguists, you had educational psychologists, you had educational practitioners or researchers such as myself and others who are focusing their attention on how is it we make meaning, particularly in the context of reading.